아래 당가서 가르치바래라나 당가는 저 지대나 아니 코아베지 대원용하기 대와세디.
Good morning. So last night we primarily looked at the feeling of happiness that arises in beings, and for ordinary beings, the vast majority of these feelings of happiness, whilst we call them happiness, are actually really just the fluctuation, the temporary decline in stronger suffering. So for example, when one is rushing around and then finally sits, then one feels happier, some relief. But really this is just the decline of suffering. It is not actual happiness. So that is primarily what we looked at last night. And so where we see in that large paragraph we looked at in the middle and to the bottom of page 162, where we see the term 1, 2, 3 lines down in that paragraph, there is no intrinsic happiness. This term here, translated as intrinsic, has two meanings. So the one meaning, which isn't the primary meaning here, but it can be applied, is that happiness does not exist by way of its own intrinsic nature, or inherently existent, or naturally existent. It does not exist in that way. So that's one meaning, but the meant meaning, the implied meaning here, is the second meaning, which is actual happiness. There is no actual happiness that is unrelated to the elimination of suffering. So it would be more clearly translated as actual rather than intrinsic. And likewise, the very top of page 163, the final word in the first line, their intrinsic should be actual too, for the same reason. If those were causes of actual happiness, and so that is the primary meaning here. That is not actual happiness, not real happiness. At the bottom of page 162, Lama Tsongkhapa gives several illustrations of what we in ordinary society, as ordinary people, consider to be happiness, because a feeling of happiness arises. Again, feelings are just threefold in Buddhism: happiness, suffering, and neutral. So a feeling of happiness arises, and this is what we consider to be happiness. So, for example, if one is walking too much, and then one sits down, one rests, then almost immediately there's this feeling of relief. This, or what we'd call a feeling of relief, but it's a feeling of happiness. And this we consider happiness. But the reality is, we end up sitting after a while, we become uncomfortable, and we need to shuffle, move in the chair, maybe even need to stand up. And likewise, with eating and drinking. So if we are really famished or parched, and we eat and we drink, then we experience a feeling of happiness, and we call this happiness. But in all these illustrations, they're not actual happiness. They are rather, firstly, just the diminishment of suffering. The suffering that came from moving around a lot, or the suffering that came from being famished or parched, that is diminished by resting, by eating, by drinking. That is all. This leads to a feeling of happiness arising, but that feeling of happiness is not actual happiness. Why? For two reasons. If it were actual happiness, as much as one then engaged in that activity of resting, of eating, drinking, one's happiness should just grow. But that doesn't happen. Overindulgence never leads to an abundance of happiness. Further suffering becomes evident. And secondly, that it is not those experiences of happiness, the causes that led to them, do not lead to lasting happiness. So therefore, these feelings of happiness, which throughout society is what we experience as happiness and call happiness, and it's what we know, this is not actually happiness, but is more accurately called the suffering of transient happiness, or the suffering of change is normally translated as. So it really is suffering, because it's the diminishment of suffering, but that's temporary. The happiness one experiences is transient, and it will change once again into suffering. So what we call happiness really is not. It is actually the suffering of transient happiness. So what identifies what we consider to be happiness as actually suffering, one of the reasons is the more you cultivate of those causes that lead to what we consider happiness, actually doesn't lead to happiness. Again, I gave other illustrations earlier, I'll just mention them quickly now. For example, going out with friends or traveling. If one were to do this and a lot, it doesn't lead to ever more happiness coming, but rather suffering will once again show. So what then are the causes? So this is the first type of feeling of happiness, which is actually the suffering of transient of happiness. It's not actual happiness. So what then is actual happiness? So actual happiness is what comes about in dependence on causes, that as these causes are developed ever more, both one's happiness continues to grow and, secondly, leads to the attainment of lasting, ultimate happiness. So what are the causes for actual happiness? So these are the cultivation of virtuous minds, such as love, such as compassion. Because these and the others, to the extent we develop them, we'll become ever happier. It's not that we will, from developing too much love, that we will then start to experience suffering. Not the case at all. Likewise, with developing the minds of generosity, ethical restraint, patience, single points of concentration, and wisdom. These are all causes that lead to actual happiness, the experience of actual happiness, in that the stronger the causes, the stronger the resulting happiness. We looked at them last night primarily on how the feelings of happiness that we experience are, well, the word was mostly, but it's really, you could say entirely, actually just transient happiness, the suffering of transient happiness. It is not actual happiness. And that is then one of the three ways, threefold division that you can place happiness into. The second, as just been mentioned, is that of actual happiness, cultivating the minds of virtue. And the third then was lasting happiness, of Buddhahood or ultimate happiness. So let's talk further now about how one can cultivate actual happiness, the happiness of the minds of virtue. Here one should recognize that whatever one's self-view is, and if one has a negative self-view, that this is misplaced, in that good qualities abide within you. Qualities such as love, compassion, and all those other virtuous minds I mentioned earlier, seeds of those or imprints of those abide on your continuum. And this is the case for everyone. The variety is the strength of those seeds. Some have some of the seeds stronger, others not so strong. And there's variety there amongst people or amongst beings. But the presence of those seeds over the course of lifetimes, those seeds have all been cultivated. Where we can experience these seeds is in our own daily lives. So, for example, a mind of love, wanting others to be happy. This we have. So too compassion, wanting others to be free of suffering. And so too with all the virtuous minds. The problem we have is that these seeds are not particularly strong. They're not in abundance yet. So therefore, our love and compassion remains biased. It arises in relation to specific individuals or groups, but not towards others. So in this way, we can recognize that love arises towards one's family, for example, compassion towards them or to one's group, but not towards others. So we can recognize, I have these seeds. And this recognition is important because it can lead to the confidence of, and therefore, by continuing to train my mind, I will strengthen these seeds. And so too with other virtuous minds, such as generosity. When we do truly give of ourselves, happiness comes. It feels good to be of service to others, to help others. Likewise with ethical restraint. That is particular in challenging circumstances, when we do what we know to be right, and we refrain from non-virtue, this feels good. So too with patience. when our mind stays undisturbed in the face of adversity and we are able to respond skillfully. This feels good. So these are the experiences of happiness that come through the ripening of our virtuous karmic seeds. Likewise too, for wisdom, and to a small degree, concentration. So we have these seeds, but they require, in particular some such as bodhicitta, do require extensive further study and meditation to cultivate much further. So this is an important point to recognize, that we do have these seeds, so that we do not inhibit ourselves by an exaggerated feeling of not good enough. All that is required, although it's easy to say, but it requires constant effort, is to nurture the seeds one has. Well, by applying, just like in the garden, a fertilizer, warmth, moisture, then seeds grow. So too with ourselves. By hearing and reflecting, the seeds will grow. And this needs to be done in two parts. There's a twofold focus that is required. So the one, as mentioned, is the cultivation of our habituation to wholesome ways of thinking, the virtuous ways of thinking, which comes down to developing ever more seeds of these minds. And then the second part to do, at that same time, is understanding the afflictions and guarding against them. Because these two classes of mind are contrary to each other. And the way to transform our mind is by strengthening one side of the ledger, the wholesome minds, the virtuous minds, and at the same time, whilst those wholesome minds are acting as antidote to our afflictions, these afflictions, which we tend to all too often be very habituated to, will continue to arise. And those we need to try not to come under the influence of. And this described here, this process of strengthening wholesome minds and not coming under the influence of unwholesome minds, this is the process that eventually leads to the attainment of the lasting happiness, the ultimate happiness of Buddhahood. So it's through cultivating the seeds of actual happiness, virtuous minds, one overcomes the afflictions and eventually attains ultimate happiness of Buddhahood. So now we'll turn to the text and starting near the top of page 163. So we've completed one presentation on suffering, looking at suffering, specific types of suffering. Now we come rather to look at sufferings of individual realms. So reading page 163, contemplating the suffering of the individual realms, which has 4 points: the suffering of the 3 lower realms, the suffering of humans, the suffering of demigods, and the suffering of gods. So wherever beings are born in samsara, whether in the lower realms, the human realm, the demigods or god realms, beings suffer. As long as one is bound in the suffering realms of samsara, one suffers. Even if one has the most exquisite of births, exquisite of existences, one continues to suffer for the same reason. So again, whether it's in the lower realms as a human or in the god realms, one suffers due to the afflictions. To come to recognize this, though, one needs to first understand or recognize suffering. One needs to see how suffering pervades the entirety of samsara. Seeing that, one will seek out what are the origins of suffering, the causes of suffering. And that is just said, is the afflictions, wherever one is born. And when recognizing that, one will give rise to the determined attitude, I need to cease these afflictions, bring about a cessation of the afflictions. How to do so? I have to strive in cultivating the paths that will lead to liberation from samsara, freedom from suffering. In other words, the 4 noble truths. When death comes, rebirth is inevitable. And rebirth is under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. We are not in control. We cannot decide, I want this rebirth, I want this existence. It is not up to us. It's rather determined by the karma we have created. And therefore, because that karma is contaminated by the presence of the afflictions and ripened by the afflictions, one remains bound in samsara. One's rebirth will be in one of two directions, either in the three lower realms or in the higher realms of humans or gods. And these are the only options these are the only, I don't use options, the only directions beings can be sent in. Their karma propels them in one of these two directions. And wherever one is born, even if it's in the greatest existence of the gods or the lowest of the hell realms or anywhere in between, one suffers. One suffers because of the afflictions. So of those four points, the first, the suffering of the three lower realms, this has already been explained, and it was explained in the context of training shared with a practitioner of initial capacity, and that was explained from page 89. There's this story from old Tibet about this point that we have no control over our rebirth, but it's rather under the will, dictated by contaminated karma and afflictions. So in the story, an educated monk, he was traveling and he stayed overnight in a family's home. And the family were doing their activities, and the mother was outside doing activities, and she asked the monk, please, can you help? There's an insect here. Can you just remove it? Because I'm afraid I'll step on it and kill it. So the monk, being educated, he was able to refer to his texts, and so he just joked around with the mother a little bit, and he said, well, all of us sentient beings, we have no control over our birth and death. Our karma dictates it. So if there's somewhere that you know that I can place this insect, that it is going to escape death, tell me, because then I will go there myself. Whilst the monk was only joking, the joke clearly wasn't communicated very well, and the mother really wasn't very impressed because she couldn't say anything, and she just thought this monk was being, not so nice. So she wasn't very impressed. Then, in the future, when traveling monks would come by and requested somewhere to stay, she would first ask, "Where are you from? And did you study there?" Wanting to know if the person was educated or not, because she didn't want to be teased in this way again. Let's then look now at the suffering of humans. So reading from the text in the middle, page 163. This consists in the sufferings of hunger and thirst, the unpleasant contact with heat and cold, frantic activity and fatigue. In addition, you should understand the 7 types of suffering, birth, aging, illness, and so forth, by means of the previous explanations. This, now we're looking specifically in terms of the realms. We have the second of the 4 divisions, suffering of humans. And here we've already looked in some detail at the eightfold presentation, and then the sixfold. Here they mention some specific types, namely again hunger and thirst, pleasant contact with heat and cold, frantic activity and fatigue. So these we all directly can recognize. They're not particularly hidden from us. But I think a point to reference here in relation to this first sentence is, whilst everyone here has experienced the sufferings of hunger and thirst, the unpleasant contact with heat and cold, frantic activity and fatigue, whilst we've all experienced these sufferings and we experience them as suffering, the way we relate to them is actually deeply flawed, and that thereby leads to the experience of suffering being greatly exaggerated. In other words, we suffer far more from each of these instances than one actually needs to suffer, because our attitude towards these suffering is not balanced, it's not realistic. So if we take hunger, for example. So everyone's been hungry, no one likes it. When we get hungry, we get, or how do you say, hangry, and we need to eat because we're feeling an emotional response. And so therefore we're experiencing suffering. So there's no denying of that. But we experience it in a way that's not balanced, it's not realistic, in that there are countless, millions, probably billions of people who, if they had our abundance of food, what we eat every day, it is significantly more than what they can access. that they are impoverished, or they live in places where there just is not much access to food. And so for us, if a meal comes a little late, we experience some suffering. But for others, they don't necessarily eat 3 meals a day. They may not even eat every day. And that is a normal experience. It's not just a bad day. So too with the second illustration of thirst. If we're thirsty, we may get a little bit anxious, or may just experience it as we cannot have the drink of our choice. But there are, again, countless millions of people, if not billions, who live without access to clean water. And their whole lives, they drink dirty water. Luckily, their immune system evolves a little bit, but all too often they get ill, and especially children can die like this. And that, for many people, is the lived reality. Our lived reality is very different here in Australia. And therefore, what we experience as suffering, other people would not experience it in that way. And likewise with heat and cold. So we go from this nice warm gompa, and then you walk over to the warm dining room, and in between it's cold, and we feel something, we have something to say about the cold air outside. Whereas you think of people, again, you can think of the many impoverished people in this world, or people working out in the cold, particularly if one thinks of Tibet, where there still are nomads. And in winter, they're outside. They may be in a cave, they may have a fire, but that is it. It is cold. And in the day, they are just walking in their clothing, and it is cold. So what we see here is that whilst these are experiences of suffering, the way we relate to them exaggerates them so, and we suffer so much more from them. So the area that I grew up in, the climate is really the same as Tibet, and there one knows cold. And certainly when I was young, there wasn't access to heating other than just a fire indoors. So at night you go to sleep, and the fire would fade, and the air would get cold. And when one's sleeping under a pile of blankets, should in one's movement any air sneak under the blankets, you'd wake from the cold. And in the morning, when the sun rises, and that announces time to get up, then it's still freezing cold. And it's not a happy experience having to remove those blankets and then rush to try and put some clothing on. So there one comes to know what cold is like. The text then continues. Furthermore, the discourse on the collections says, now I've just changed the last line and one word in the third line. All the sufferings of lower rebirths also appear to exist for humans. They are tormented by sufferings like beings in hell, are subjects of yama by their poverty, and also have the sufferings of animals. Powerful ones oppress the weak by force, inflicting harm on them. These sufferings flow on like a river. The first 2 lines, all the sufferings of lower rebirths also appear to exist for humans. So the various suffering experiences that animals have, spirits have, and beings in hell have, these to usually lesser degrees, humans also experience. All the sufferings of lower rebirths also appear to exist for humans. In other words, just because we are born in a higher realm, it doesn't mean we have escaped the sufferings of the lower realms, that we are free from them. So, for example, looking at thinking about the sufferings of beings in hell, the third line, they are tormented by suffering like beings in hell. So here we can think just in terms of weather, in terms of climate. So when it's baking hot and we cannot escape from the heat, our body will burn. So here in particular, if you imagine oneself where one is unprotected from the blazing sun, one's body will burn and one will suffer from that. And likewise, when the weather is cold and one cannot protect oneself from the cold, one develops frostbite and it pains. So in this way, we can see simple illustrations of suffering that's similar to beings in hell. A further illustration, which used to be really prevalent in the world, but these days not, certainly in countries like this, not at all to the same degree, is that when imprisoned by those with power, one would routinely be beaten, would be tortured, would have pain willingly inflicted upon you. This would be considered normal routine. So this then is also similar to beings in hell. The fourth line, are subjects of yama by their poverty. So this refers to beings in the preta realm. So the text doesn't say it, but subjects of yama by their poverty. So just like pretas who suffer greatly from being impoverished of the necessities of life, namely food and drink. There are certainly people in our world who, due to impoverishment, they also struggle to sustain their life, struggle to get enough to eat, struggle to access clean water, and so forth. So to explain why the term yama is used here, because yama is a term we normally have translated into English as Lord of Death, and we associate with the hell realms, or with the Lord of Death, sorry, that's one normal term of it, whereas it clearly doesn't seem to fit here. In other contexts, it can even be translated as the king of the world. But here it refers to a place, probably it would be like a charnel ground, so our very nice cemeteries, but how they would have been in the past, where the corpses would be disposed of. So these places would be places without food, without drinking water, because it's where corpses are disposed of. So it really refers more to burial grounds. The yama here refers not to a being, but to burial grounds. So such places would be without food, without water, and so forth. So part of the Tibetan word translated into Sanskrit as yama. So that's 4 syllables. The first syllable actually can mean, in other circumstances, an excellent environment. So this is just being said to try to give a breadth of this term and why it applies here in a realm where it isn't usually utilized. So the third line was likening or showing the similarity, the crossover between the experiences of human beings and those in hell. And the fourth line was in relation to those in the spirit realm, in particular the pretas. Then the next 3 lines, and also have the suffering of animals. Powerful ones oppress the weak by force, inflicting harm on others. So if we think back to not so long ago, when there weren't yet motor vehicles, then goods were transported by animals. And later when there were carts, but before there weren't carts, the goods were placed directly on animals. So we can think of camels, we can think of oxen, we can think of horses, yaks. They were really beasts of burden, in that the trader or the farmer would pile up as much as that animal could potentially bear and then beat them to make them walk and carry that heavy load a distance. And that distance could be through deserts, it could be, or dry regions, it could be through mountains, and certainly may well be through areas of some danger. And the whole way, the animal was made against its will. This wasn't its wish. Against its will to labor in this way with no real concern about its welfare. And the concern for welfare wouldn't really go much beyond seeing this animal as a commodity, as opposed to a being with sentience. And therefore, these animals would not be treated well. They'd routinely be beaten. They would not be fed sufficiently, because that's a cost. So this we know from history, but people certainly are treated like this. In the past, it was commonplace for peasantry, and still for much of the world. They are burdened by labor. They are beaten and abused, and they are, and all too often, in terms of modern-day slavery, where people are, how do you say this word? I can't say the word I'm looking for, but due to being bound by debt to their owners, they work to pay off their debt. This is still too common in our world. So we see people burdened by labor, beaten and abused. And this is not different from animals. Particularly when we look at these, the 6th and 7th line, powerful ones oppress the weak by force, inflicting harm on them. And here there's an abundance of examples that can come to mind from the lived experience of many humans. And the final line, these sufferings flow on like a river. So here the imagery that comes to mind is a great river, perhaps arising from a natural source, so a spring or an inexhaustible source. This river never ceases, it never dries up. And this is how the experience is for humans. That as long as one is an ordinary being, suffering befalls one. Suffering of a variety of magnitude, from a variety of iterations. But one continues to suffer again and again. So what's presented here is something we all know, we've experienced, and we've observed it in our world. And we know this isn't something unique to today, but it has always been like this. So how we're talking here is really topics that we tend to avoid, we do not dwell on. Our aversion to suffering is such that people do not want to think about this. And they certainly do not want to think about the reality that our current situation is incredibly unstable due to the underlying current of impermanence, and can be influenced by causes abiding on our continuum that can lead to a radically different set of circumstances coming about at any time. This is the reality of our situation. We need to recognize this vulnerable position that we are in. That right now we live a particular life with a particular abundance of good conditions. The seeds for ongoing good conditions, those abide within us, but so too do karmic seeds that can lead to radically different circumstances like we observe elsewhere in the world today. So we need to, through this way of thinking, recognize the reality of suffering, as opposed to keep turning our gaze away from it, not wanting to dwell on it, not even wanting to experience that slight mental discomfort of thinking about suffering. We need to, coming to know suffering, recognize the causes, contaminated karma, and the afflictions. This then means we have these seeds on us, within us, and we need to thereby recognize the precariousness of our situation. This will lead us to a yearning. I don't want it to experience what I observe elsewhere. I do not want to live like some beings are. Recognizing that can come about by eradicating the causes, cessation can be attained. When then we'll have a determined attitude to striving to eradicate or to purify the contaminated karma in our continuum, and to abandon the afflictions, to not come under the influence, but rather develop virtuous paths in our mind. So this is the stream of reflection one needs to engage in, where one starts with the truth of suffering and progresses through all four truths to give rise to the conclusion of striving in virtue. As I've mentioned a number of times as we work through this presentation on true sufferings, is in terms of the types of sufferings that beings experience, there's not too much that you'll hear that is unknown to you. But what I keep encouraging you to do is to take this information and apply it to meditation. Do not make the mistake of, yes, I know this, and now I'm ready for something else. This is a mere recognition, just like many of the prior steps in the meditation. Yes, I know death will come. That mere recognition doesn't lead to a change of heart. We need the context here to take to heart the precariousness of our situation. What the our current lived experience, or the lived experience of this life, is something we tend to take for granted, to see as ordinary, as commonplace, and therefore is something that we expect to continue to have throughout this life. And in fact, we expect it to perhaps get a bit better. And in terms of when we think of our future lives, we imagine them in a similar context to what we are enjoying in this life. This way of thinking is deeply flawed. Taking for granted our circumstances, seeing these as commonplace, as ordinary, is deeply flawed. And it's that leads to complacency and this opportunity that we have not even being recognized. So the meditation to engage in is taking these various presentations on suffering that have been presented throughout this chapter and relating each one to one's own lived experience, recognizing the truth of it in relation to what I have directly experienced. Thereafter, one also, in the same meditation, recalls how these sufferings are experienced by others. And as I've mentioned this morning, we call to mind what we observe in the world, whether people in our general community or abroad, whether human and non-human, and recognize just how strong some people suffer. And we need to imagine ourselves in that situation and recognize that that is a real possibility. That just because things are so good for me now does not mean they will be this good tomorrow or next life. Cannot take that for granted. How? And we need to relate to the lived experiences of others with this understanding. How would it be for me if I had to endure what they endure? This then will mean that we are relating to what we observe in the world, not as a story, some pity, how nice it would be if it was different for them, but that this can actually happen to me because the causes abide within me. And those causes may meet ripening conditions in this very life, or they may well do so as I move into my next life. Such lived experiences may well befall me. So relating to it in this personal way leads to a very different emotional response, a very different emotional experience. And this is what we need to cultivate in analytical meditation. This is how one utilizes analytical meditation to lead to a change in the way that we experience our world, what we value and what we prioritize. Recognizing that lives previous to this, I would have engaged in some behavior that right now I may consider as surprising. And thereby I have seeds for great suffering abiding on my continuum. Also, if we think of earlier in our lives, some of the views and activities we did, those karmic seeds too abide on our continuum. So therefore, there is a real possibility that these favorable circumstances that I have now may well end in this life. But certainly I cannot take for granted that next life will be as comfortable as this. So now, whilst I still have this precious human rebirth, I cannot take it for granted any longer. I need to cultivate the recognition that from tomorrow, these favorable circumstances I have right now may be exhausted. So from right now, in this meditation, I now cultivate the wish to give of myself. I'll cultivate the determined attitude to restrain myself within the bounds of what is ethical and not to bring harm. And just to say, in these meditations, building on the reflection on suffering, having this emotional response, one needs to develop these virtuous minds, not just as a mere acceptance. Yes, it's good to give. Yes, I won't harm others. Not just a mere expression of I won't kill, I won't steal. But it needs to be deep within you so that engaging in virtue refraining from non-virtue, becomes a natural expression of who you are. That the thought to take from others, the thought to speak harshly to others, doesn't even arise. This is the degree we need to get to, which means we need to develop a strong emotional response to virtue and against non-virtue. Further, in the meditation, look at how we relate to others. And here, particularly, I'm thinking of these two lines, 6th and 7th. Powerful ones oppress the weak by force, inflicting harm on them. Here, look at how you interact with others. Particular, where you have some authority, but even with those where you're on the same level, look at how you relate to them, look at how you treat them. And ensure in your meditation you develop the attitude, no matter the circumstance, no matter the person, no matter the power dynamic between us, I will treat them with respect and with kindness. In meditation, but in particular in between meditation, if you are keeping mindfulness or awareness of your of your own mind, being aware that when a negative thought or an unwholesome thought of any shade arises, recognize that as being an affliction. So if it's a negative thought about others, or about oneself, about circumstances around you, recognize it's just an expression of the afflictions. And thereby, immediately turn your mind to virtue, the opposing virtuous mind. So if one's criticizing, recognize the person's good qualities, and rather relate to this person through recognition of their kindness and their good qualities than whatever it is one is criticizing about. Then, here the purpose of this is to recognize the role the afflictions play and how easily they arise, so that we can come to understand ourselves better and what sends us off in a negative direction, as opposed to keeping us on virtue. Moreover, if one has good knowledge of, good studies of emptiness, then one will relate to the next part in a different way. But if one doesn't, one just reminds oneself, all these afflictions have the same root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping. By abandoning this, all the afflictions will cease and liberation will be attained. So for most of us, that recognition is as far as we will go now, as opposed to actually engaging in meditation on emptiness. Again, it depends on one's education. But the importance of this recognition is that we do not become dispirited, we do not lose confidence, we do not think something's beyond us, because at least intellectually I know freedom is possible. I have to engage in meditation on emptiness with a concentrated mind. And for those who have that education, this is what they will do. For those who do not, then they will strengthen the determination to cultivate the indispensable causes that are required and dedicate that virtue to being able to meditate on emptiness and develop single-pointed concentration. So they'll strive in developing virtuous minds which are within their grasp, those which are contrary to the afflictions. So developing minds such as generosity, such as ethics, as patience, as joyous perseverance, as love, as compassion. And strive in cultivating these virtues, because this virtue that one is cultivating keeps one's mind away from the afflictions, gives us the mental strength that through our dedications, later, we will be able to come to gain the knowledge and do the meditations to develop wisdom, understanding emptiness, and a concentrated mind. So this then is how we should practice skillfully. So the meditation has started out looking at suffering, true sufferings, true origins, recognizing that this can be brought to a state of cessation through cultivating virtuous minds, and one has then engaged in meditation on cultivating these virtuous minds. So one has, in the session, engaged in meditation on the Four Noble Truths. By doing so, repeatedly over a sustained period, you will experience inner change. You will experience that the afflictions are arising less often. And that when they arise, you notice and you can much more easily dispel them. You also notice that the way you interact with others is changing, and you would have heard so from them. You're seeing that you are more skillful in how you respond to life's challenges. So here you are experiencing, you're tasting the Dharma within, experiencing that inner transformation. Here you have then also, through engaging in the trainings which are shared with practitioners of initial and now intermediate capacity, you're developing the preliminary practices for the training that are unique to a being of great capacity. Because where you are now in your training is you have come to experience the Dharma. You're seeing you are a better person. You are suffering less. You are being contributing well to the lives of others. Then, when one lifts one's gaze to others, compassion will readily arise, because one will recognize how those around you, they, despite yearning for happiness, they keep destroying the causes that will lead for happiness by rather following the afflictions, and thereby creating causes for suffering. And you recognize how through people's misperceiving reality, following the deluded minds, their afflictions, believing in those delusions, they continue to create the causes that lead to their suffering. And you'll observe how, as opposed to yourself, you're starting to feel that you're breaking a little free from this prison of suffering. You can observe how others are actually strengthening the chains that keep them bound in this prison of samsara. From that, compassion readily arises, naturally arises. One can then, with that foundation, with that preliminary practice done, one can develop compassion, develop love, develop the wholehearted resolve and bodhicitta, the determined attitude. I can't leave beings suffering like this, deluded by their ignorance, continuing to make mistakes, continuing to follow their afflictions, thinking that somehow this time it will lead to happiness. And this way one generates bodhicitta. So in one's meditation then, one sees how through training in the Four Noble Truths, one is developing the preliminary practice by which actual bodhicitta will be generated. In this presentation this morning, I've hopefully made it quite clear what is meant by analytical meditation. It's using knowledge, it's thinking about it, it's relating to oneself in order to lead to an emotional response, a change in our way of thinking. For that change to actually come about, the same meditation needs to be done repeatedly. A further point then to make, and to really emphasize, is the disconnect between how we mostly live as opposed to how we need to live in order to transform our mind. So the way we, as a translator, I'm using this word live quite lightly, but the way we live is that our mind is primarily caught up in what we observe through our senses, what we see around us and what we hear, and then what we taste and smell and touch. This is primarily what occupies our mind. And we'll be drawn to what we've observed through our senses from the past, and we'll have hopes about that for the future. And then when you watch your mind, you'll be commenting on those that you see, commenting on your environment around you, and commenting is a nice way to say you'll either be drawn with attachment or repulsed with some form of aversion. What we don't see is ourselves. So here we're really talking on the physical level. We don't see ourselves unless we're standing in front of a mirror. We do not see ourselves. All those around us are just like us, caught up in what they're observing through their senses, not seeing themselves. But they are looking at us and having whatever thoughts, judgments on our physical appearance, just like we have judgments on what appears to us. They all have judgments on what we're saying, just like we do. Caught up in what's external. And so too, and it's not just with the material world, because actually we don't really look at our own mind very much. So through the training that you've been doing, you'll be doing so much more so than most people. So we're speaking in general. But even still for ourselves, we are primarily caught up with the minds that others are expressing towards us. And we'll make judgments in relation to that. So how others are acting, how others are speaking, is an expression of their mind. And then we'll make a judgment on them. Nice person, not a nice person. And from this, we'll be drawn to them or repulsed by them. So again, we are caught up with the display of other people's minds as opposed to watching our own minds. So then, this we need to recognize the reality. This is almost always where our mind is. What the texts say is that we should relate to teachings, so oral teachings, as well as what we read, as being a mirror for our mind. That the texts and the teachings we should take as personal advice, personal instructions for us. And the time to employ this mirror is when we are reading the book, when we are hearing the teaching, and when we are not. At all times, being aware of our own mind. So we're hearing a teaching, and we think how wonderful it would be to cultivate this understanding of true sufferings, cultivate a deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths so that I can actually develop bodhicitta in this life. This arises within us. And that kind of response comes about in dependence on one's seeds, being moistened by the Dharma. But one needs to actually bring that about. One needs to utilize the teachings as a mirror to our mind at all times. So that when we are engaging in the world, whilst we are seeing and hearing, we are more aware of our response, our mind, how our mind responds to what we are seeing and hearing, rather than caught up in this outer display. And in this way, we can then employ the meaning of these teachings to our mind. And this way, we are using the teachings as a mirror to our mind whilst we are interacting in the world, whether alone or with others, but we are watching our mind, seeing how we respond to what we see, what we hear, and so forth. Then, at the very bottom and over the page is a quotation from Adideva's 400 verses. Higher ones have mental suffering, lower ones have physical pain. This world is overwhelmed by those two types of suffering every day. The meaning of this verse. So the first line refers to those who have privilege in society. So the higher ones, those who have privilege in society, they have material comfort, financial security. Their health is perhaps good, or at least they are in a position where they are able to look after their health. And they have some status, some influence in society. So to understand the privileged, one needs to really see them in contrast to lower ones or those who are without privilege. So those who are struggling to feed their family, those who are struggling to house themselves, those who have no status or influence and are really at the mercy of others. So the two contrasting groups of people both suffer. The general way they suffer is quite different in that those who are privileged mainly suffer from mental anguish, in that they do not have to struggle about feeding themselves or having somewhere safe to live, or can easily be harmed by others. So their suffering is primarily mental, whereas those common people or low ones, they mainly suffer from physical needs, in that they are not worrying about their investment portfolio. They are worrying about whether they will be able to have a meal today. They are worrying about whether they will find somewhere to live, and so forth. So the suffering of the two groups is very different. However, this world is overwhelmed by these two types of suffering every day. So as it says clearly, this is the lived experience of beings throughout our world, of humans throughout our world. Lama Tsongkhapa then concludes with, reflect in accordance with these statements. Here, as mentioned, relate to your own lived experiences and see the similarities between the suffering that you have experienced is the similarities it has with beings in the lower realms. How there is a similarity between what humans experience, as those do in the hells, or pretas do, and animals do. So that we don't only hear about those lower realms as being something somewhere else, kind of like a story, but to recognize it as real. It's a far stronger version of what humans experience. And when you think about the strength of karmic seeds accumulated, it makes sense, therefore, that there will be life forms where those certain sufferings are so much more pronounced. We also, and of the three lower realms, perhaps it's most effective to think about the suffering of animals just because we're so familiar with them. They live in our homes, they live in the garden, and we see them in nature programs and so forth. So we know how the powerful prey on the weak. That animals do not sit about relaxed. They are always tense because they have predators. They are those who are constantly looking to eat them. And when there are problems, there's very little they can do about them. So this we need to recognize to see that this is something that quite possibly I may experience in a stronger version of it in this life, or I may well fall into those lower realms. And then in terms of humans, so the verse from Aryadeva, to recognize that whatever one's circumstances are, whether wealthy or impoverished, whether one is famous or powerful or on the bottom rungs of society, one suffers. Those who are wealthy are not basking in happiness. Those who are famous, those who are powerful, are not basking in happiness. This we really need to take to heart so that we can recognize that there is nothing to hope for in samsara that has any abiding value. Thinking if only I moved up in society, if my status was greater, my wealth was greater, then it would be different. Happiness cannot be found in these ways. The outcome then, I must gain freedom from this. I must break this wheel of suffering. I have to destroy the causes that keep me bound here through transforming my mind, through cultivating virtue and refraining from the afflictions. Nothing else matters. This needs to be my priority. Then thank you. We can conclude there for this morning. Thank you very much.